The history of armour for ships is something that comes in fits and starts throughout early history and across many cultures. Various experiments came and went, with such vessels as the Korean turtle ships carrying a form of iron plate armour, some American Civil War ships like the Kearsarge improvising armour from iron chains, and indeed the wooden hulls of Age of Sail warships also being a form of armour, as the thick wooden sides of these ships could resist small arms fire, and depending on the size of ship and the thickness and species of wood used, could sometimes even resist the smaller cannonballs in certain cases. However, the start of the almost unbroken line of development that would bring about the armoured battleships of the 20th century had its origins in the first half of the 19th. During this period, iron was beginning to be manufactured in the quantity, and in theory the quality, that was needed to use plates and beams of iron to supplement or replace wood in ship construction. There was some initial resistance on the ground that, well, wood floats and iron rather obviously does not. But after the demonstration of the first iron barges and the like, those who were not entirely au fait with things like the law of displacement were mostly silenced, and the first iron ships began to enter service in the civilian world. Iron held a lot of attractions. Although it was much denser than wood, it was also stronger, meaning that a heavily built wooden ship could actually be replicated in iron and weigh less at the same time. There were also considerable space savings to be had. An iron beam whose thickness was measured in inches could do the job of a wooden beam whose thickness was measured in feet. Large wooden timbers were becoming scarce, whereas iron could be manufactured in great lengths and securely bonded by riveted joints where an even greater length was needed. An iron plate an inch thick could replace wooden sides that were feet thick, and so overall internal volume became greater, and with the lesser weight of the hull, heavier goods could be carried. Iron didn't rot, iron didn't flex as much as wood did, and this promised longer lasting and physically longer ships. Now this all sounded great, and from a military perspective, being stronger, iron could resist more shot than any practical thickness of wood. Iron was not flammable, which was very important given recent innovations in explosive shells, heated shot, and its successor, the molten iron-filled Martin shell, and further, tests appeared to show that when you shot at it with something that was big enough to punch through it, you ended up with a small cannonball-shaped hole that could be fairly easily patched, and which resulted in few, if any, splinters, as opposed to wooden ships where a 32-pound or heavier shot coming through was accompanied by a vast cloud of lethal oak splinters and a large ragged hole that was rather difficult to make good, assuming that anybody in the nearby vicinity had survived to make the attempt. But, of course, if it sounds too good to be true, it usually is. And in this case, there were a number of issues that were less appreciated at first, and at least until after the first generation of iron warships had been laid down. The mass of the iron in the ship's hull affected the magnetic compasses that were used for navigation. The copper plating that was used to keep marine growth away from ships' hulls induced a galvanic battery reaction with the iron of the hull when the ship was immersed in salt water, and this corroded both of them to nothing in fairly short order. And having your ship literally dissolve itself away into nothing is a pretty good party trick, but not really good for the long-term health of the crew. Lastly, there came news from further tests, as well as combat actions abroad, that the iron was behaving in strange ways. Instead of behaving as it had done in tests, iron plates were shattering, leaving large holes, and sending large chunks of razor-edged metal scything through the gun decks. Massive cracks were developing that ran across multiple decks and often ran the full length of a given plate. Rather rapidly, iron warships were cancelled, and those that had already been built or were too far along in construction were turned into survey ships, troop ships, tugboats, and really practically anything that a navy could need that wouldn't involve direct combat. Now, what exactly had happened here? The problem was one of several material properties of iron and steel, which didn't really occur in wood at human livable temperatures, if at all. And one of these would be the dominant factor in almost all armour development thereafter, and was particularly responsible for this particular issue. That is the brittle, ductile transition. This is a bit of engineering and materials science, so forgive me if I get a bit technical on you, but this is one of the fields I studied for my engineering degree and one that I was relatively good at. Essentially, iron has what is called an impact energy. That is the amount of energy you need to hit it with a kinetic impact in order to break it. The kinetic impact being something like, say, shooting at it with a cannon shot or an explosive shell. However, this energy varies, as you can see on this lovely graph, according to the temperature of the metal involved. It's a rather steep gradient in most cases, and below a certain point of temperature, significantly less energy is needed to break the iron than is needed much above that point. The nature of the failure is also key. An impact that occurs to the left of this transitional line will cause a brittle failure, which is essentially a shattering effect that you might more commonly associate with glass or something that's been dropped in liquid nitrogen, which is actually the same brittle ductile transition effect, just dropping the temperature of practically anything that you can handle below its own transition point. Above this, you get ductile failure, that's to the right of the line, and this involves the material splitting and bending. Again, to use an extreme example, this is an effect a bit more like poking a hole in a sheet of cardboard with a pencil or stabbing into a plastic drinks bottle. Now, the early tests of cannon against iron had seen the latter ductile behaviour. Now, reports were coming in of the brittle type of failure. But the material being used on the ships was not that much removed from the material that had been used in the test. So what was the problem? Well, it was this change in temperature. A sheet of iron set up on a grassy field on a summer's day would be considerably warmer than practically any metal sheet built into the side of a ship that was then placed in a cold ocean. In some very warm environments, such as the shallow coastal waters off China, ships like the East India merchant vessel Nemesis had still seen ductile behaviour, but in the more common deep ocean environment that covered most of the planet and the North Atlantic haunts of most of the major navies at the time, the brittle behaviour was experienced, which not only meant that iron ships would resist shot far less well than expected in the first place, because of that lower impact energy, but the damage caused would also be far greater. There were also further complications that with ships' hulls cracking under the stress of oceanic operations instead of flexing as was intended, but that's a completely different story. There was one other factor that was playing into all of this, and that was the presence of trace elements or impurities in the iron. As you can see, these change the duration and location of the brittle to ductile transition point on the scale of temperature, as well as making a difference to the overall resistance of the iron. Because, of course, the iron that was being forged was not pure elemental iron. We leave that to dwarves who dig too greedily and too deep. The presence of carbon, manganese, chromium, molybdenum, all sorts of other random little bits and pieces would all have their own effect, and more on some of those later. But it just so happened that the mix of trace elements in iron produced at the time placed the transition point squarely in the operational range of temperatures that warships would experience, with the most of that transition occurring at somewhat at the higher end of things. And this was the cause of the unexpected issues, and the fact the iron was performing completely differently depending on how warm the environment was. And so it was that the use of metal protection for shipping dropped back a little bit until the Crimean War. During this period, the Industrial Revolution was taking place, and iron was being produced in larger amounts, in thicker plates, and in slightly different mixtures, with improvements to purity as well, leading to changes in the overall resistance and the material behaviour of iron plate. And so, during this Crimean conflict, floating batteries coated in iron plates were employed, having been proposed a few years ago by a number of different inventors. These proved to be highly proficient at keeping out shot and shell, pointing the way forward and indicating that armouring of ships against incoming fire was both now possible and practical. Now, before we usher in the Age of Armour, a few more notes on iron and eventually steel production. There were other factors that would go on to affect the material properties of the material. The method of production mattered, both in manufacture and in finish, removing contact between the fuel and the iron with the development of puddling furnaces allowed a much greater degree of control over the level of impurities, whether you wanted them or whether you wanted to get rid of them. And other techniques would follow during the development of armour, as we'll see when it becomes more relevant. But the main thing to take away at this point is those puddling furnaces, since this removed iron and later steel production from the old school method, where you would end up with the raw ore in amongst the burning charcoal, coal, wood, or whatever it was you were using, which of course allowed all sorts of fun things that were in your fuel to find their way into your metal. Additional to this, there were various methods of finishing. You could hammer an ingot down into shape, you could compress it between giant rollers, and some people experimented with a few other ways. This would of course affect the overall strength and behaviour of the metal, and the limits on the capabilities of these industries would indeed affect much early armour development in various nations. Only the most advanced countries, for instance, had the industrial capacity and capability to manufacture good quality sheets of iron of significant thickness, whereas others who could only make thinner plates or poor quality thick plates would have to settle for either lesser single thickness protection or laminate thinner sheets and use the sheer bulk that you could achieve in this method to compensate for the deficiencies in resistance that were inherent in laminated metal armour. And finally, you have how you finish treating the metal. Whilst this is less of a concern with basic iron, as you introduce more trace elements and head towards steel, how a metal is cooled, how long it takes, what temperature you brought it up to in the first place, and all sorts of other interesting factors become more and more important. But again, we'll cover elements of that when it becomes more relevant. Essentially, what all this leads to, in very basic terms, is the ability to create metal that can fall anywhere on this rather handy 2x2 grid. You have hard, soft, also known as strong, weak, on one axis, and brittle, ductile on the other. A hard or strong metal needs a lot of energy to actually break it, and a soft, weak one needs less. And we've already covered what brittle and ductile mean in terms of the manner of failure. Most commonly, metals tend towards either hard and brittle, or strong and brittle, or soft and ductile, or weak and ductile. And you either need to work with this, or, as we'll see, you can start creating esoteric alloys and or production methods to try and get a better mix of behaviours. And to give one final set of extreme examples before we get on with the history of armour, an example of hard and brittle would be a rock or metal drilling bit, which is incredibly hard, razor-edged, and when it comes out the packaging at least, and can eat through lesser metals and stone with relative ease, but will also shatter into a million pieces if you happen to drop it 6 foot onto a concrete floor, and can be snapped in two if you lock it in a vise and tap it lightly on the side with a hammer. Conversely, soft and ductile would be best represented by perhaps an iron nail. A reasonably strong person can bend an iron nail with their hands, but unless you bend it back and forth so many times that you end up work hardening it, it's not actually going to break. Work hardening is another factor with metals, but it's not one we'll go into just now. And so, after the false dawn of the iron ships, the first true armoured warships would appear at the close of the 1850s. With the new technologies available and the increasing power and destructive ability of naval guns, both Britain and France, as the leading naval powers at the time, were considering the next step in warship evolution, taking lessons from the floating batteries that they'd both used in the recent conflict. They had a choice: wrought iron, which we've discussed mostly in the previous section, or cast iron. Cast iron was cheaper, and it had a much higher carbon content, but it was brittle and it had a tendency to crack with fractures running the length of the plate, features that, given their past experience with the iron ships, naval designers weren't exactly keen on. Thus, wrought iron would be the material for the ironclad warship. Ductile and malleable forms of cast iron were decades in the future. The first ships to be so protected would be the French Gloire class and the British Warrior class ironclads, the former being wooden ships that were fitted with iron plate, and the latter iron ships with armour plate over an iron hull. However, Warrior's armour was given an 18-inch thick teak wood backing, whilst Gloire likewise retained a portion of the thick wooden hull of Age of Sail warships. Since the thicker plates used, between 4.5 and 4.7 inches depending on the ship, could resist almost any incoming shot or shell available at the time, but to provide resistance against cracking of the plates and their connecting bolts, as well as to catch spalling from the back of the plates, the wood was also necessary. The wood backing also reduced the chances of penetration by distributing the force of the impact more widely across the plate than the metal plate alone would have done. Now, both ships did have some issues. Gloire's wooden hull flexed and strained at sea under the load imposed by the iron plating as well as its own natural mass, and the screws that were used to fit the iron to the wood showed that they were a critical point of failure under fire or indeed under heavy load. Warrior's iron hull was a much better platform to mount the armour to, but its own plates were fitted together with tongue and groove joints. The theory being to distribute impacts that occurred close to the edges of a plate to adjacent plates, which was a good idea in principle, but turned out to be substantially less effective in practice, and the tongue and groove fitting made replacement and maintenance of the arm plates considerably more difficult than it otherwise needed to be. Material quality was also important. Gloire's plates were 0.2 of an inch thicker than Warrior's, but gunnery tests by both parties showed that Warrior's plate was manufactured of superior material, as it took less damage when resisting the same shot. Now, in this period, the use of scrap iron was favoured in the manufacture of armour plate for a number of reasons when mixed with new iron. One of them being that as scrap iron had already been manufactured, it had been purified to an extent at least once before, which would lead to overall a more controllable output of the new material, since even at this point in time the level of control that could be exerted over potentially fatally compromising impurities was still somewhat limited. These ships' initial success spurred the development, inevitably, of bigger and better guns to penetrate the new protection, which in turn demanded thicker and better armour to counter them. In the UK, this took the form of the Special Committee on Iron, which brought together engineers, metallurgists, and naval architects to work on better sources of raw material, better production methods, and better forms of use for iron armour plate, including some experiments with inclined armour. Ironically, knowing in full detail the properties of the excellent armour they were developing, they were also the best placed to advise on how to defeat the said armour, with their work also informing gun makers as to the size of their guns, the speed of the projectiles, and the form and material of shot and shell that would best defeat an enemy ship's protection. The two main processes for manufacture at this point were hammering and rolling. The former method was essentially the same way that swords and other weapons had been hand-forged in ancient times, only on a much larger scale. You'd heat up huge chunks of iron, usually a mixture of reused scrap and newly made puddled iron, and then massive mechanical hammers would smash the material together again and again, forge welding it into a single mass, and also shaping it to the dimensions and thickness that were needed. This was, believe it or not, a relatively simple method to use, and was employed in the making of HMS Warrior's armour plate, as well as that for a number of other early ironclads. Rolling the plate was harder to do. Again, you'd stack up your various bits of heated iron, except now they were fed through giant rollers akin to a gargantuan mangle, which squeezed the plates together and down into a thinner single plate. This gave a more uniform quality of metal compared to the hammering process, but whereas the older method of hammering could use numerous smaller, if still hugely powerful machines, the rolling process required a single massive and massively powerful machine, which was itself fairly difficult to manufacture and required a huge factory. However, with Britain being the leading industrial power, in less than half a decade they'd managed to make the process significantly easier and much more common. The need to build the industry that was required to build the machine parts that were needed to build the rolling machines that could then produce the iron plate itself was one of the major bottlenecks for a number of other countries for some years to come, And this is why, despite the extensive use of iron armor plate in various forms during the American Civil War, which occurred obviously in the 1860s, it doesn't feature too highly in the overall development of naval armor, since America was one of those countries with this technological bottleneck, and therefore, whilst many innovative ways of making armor plate work, such as using railway sleepers and chains, as we mentioned earlier, came about during this conflict, they were more methods of making do with what you've got rather than pushing the technological envelope. However, even at this stage, 5, 6 years after the first armoured warships had properly been deployed, new methods were being considered, and this led to a second, if somewhat less disruptive, false dawn, as the Bessemer process and other related processes in the mid-1850s started to produce large quantities of steel. This was immediately studied as a possible alternate material, since the much stronger steel was seen to possibly serve to either improve protection or reduce weight, as even by this point ships were on the drawing board with double the thickness of armour found aboard the Warrior. And this meant that armour was beginning to take up more and more of a ship's displacement. Fortunately, the system of testing before construction was now fully in place, and so when the test showed that the steel was far too brittle for practical use in ship's armour, it was put aside as an armour material, at least for now, without any classes of steel-armoured warships being prematurely laid down. However, as time marched on, there were physical limits to what you could do to strengthen iron, whilst gun and shell technology just kept on going. By the 1880s, iron plates 18 to 20 inches or even thicker were being used to have even a hope of keeping out the latest high-velocity armour-piercing guns, which had grown from the relatively short 6 and 7-inch weapons of the early 1860s through to the somewhat longer-barreled 12, 13, 16.5 and 17-inch guns that were using ever more powerful explosives to propel their shells through the air. Whereas Warrior and her kin had been fully seagoing, in order to reduce the target area of the ships so as to minimise the space that needed protection, the last ironclads were gradually becoming squatter and less able to handle the open sea, trending more towards giant monitors, purely because of the sheer weight of armour they had to carry. Understanding the relationship between the iron armour and its wooden backing, attempts were now made to replicate this effect with steel and iron, with the much harder steel, in theory, resisting or breaking up an incoming shell, with the more ductile iron supporting and distributing the load behind it. With the steel having so much more resistance per inch, this outer face could then be made thinner and thus lighter than the sheer monolithic iron that would be needed otherwise. However, early attempts to replicate the wood-iron combination by simply bolting a steel face onto an iron plate didn't work very well, with in some cases the steel actually being a detriment, as fragments of shattered steel plate were forced back into the iron, spreading it apart and making it easier for the shell to force its way through in a manner similar to World War II-era armour-piercing shells with their armour-piercing caps. Additionally, once they were broken, shattered shards of armour steel would fall away, exposing the now much thinner iron plate to relatively easy penetration by follow-up shots. Attempts were therefore made to see if making the steel a little bit softer might work, which would in theory allow the replacement of the whole belt with a thinner belt of softer steel. You wouldn't have quite the same increase in resistance that you would with the brittle steel, but it would still be better than iron on its own, and thus you could reduce the thickness somewhat. In tests, this seemed to be possible, but in practice, the steel was still far too vulnerable to breaking up under stress, these various issues frustrating early French and Italian efforts to get ahead of the game. With Britain at this point still the leading industrial power, the solution would eventually come from the UK, as in the late 1870s, the great steel-making city of Sheffield yielded up 2 engineers who managed to solve the problem independently. Mr. Wilson of John Brown and Company worked out a technique that involved placing a wrought iron plate in a casting box, and then simply, as it might sound, pouring molten steel on top of it. Whilst Mr. Ellis of Camel Laird took a pre-made steel plate, then put it next to an iron plate with a small gap between, and poured molten steel into the resulting gap. In either case, this created a bonded plate that was made of steel on one side and iron on the other. This plate could then be heated up and rolled out to a final thickness, with the steel generally making up about a third of the plate's overall thickness. This gave the world the first successful compound armour. As discussed, this replicates the effect of backing iron with wood, only with the much harder steel taking the place of iron, and the iron taking the place of the wood. The steel provided superior resistance, but the welding effect created by the new manufacturing techniques prevented broken shards from falling off or spreading the iron in the back apart, whilst the iron provided additional resistance whilst preventing weak spots from being exposed by holding on to the steel. The iron also spread the shockwave through the whole plate, the same way that the wood did for the iron, and kept any broken steel elements together in one location, which assisted in resisting follow-up shots. This overall gave armour an instant kinetic resistance bonus of about 20 to 30%, depending on the technique, the material quality being used, and the relative thickness of the two plates that were being sandwiched together. Not only would this allow ships to continue to be protected against the advancing power of guns, but a ship that had previously needed 24 inches of armour could now make do with only 18 inches. And it also began to make armouring smaller ships, such as cruisers, against their own guns much more possible, thus paving the way for the rise of the armoured cruiser. Compound armour, however, would prove to be the shortest-lived of the armour technologies, as steel technology was still advancing at quite the rapid pace, which helped compound armour still further, obviously, as it was made partially of steel. But in the latter part of the 1880s, those various trace elements we mentioned earlier on began to come into play, as various alloys were now being deliberately created, apart from the fact that obviously steel is in and of itself an alloy of iron. Chrome alloy steel gave shells a massive increase in punching power, whilst nickel alloy steel now promised a steel that could stand up to incoming fire on its own without scattering to the four winds. This was because nickel steel introduced the element, shockingly, nickel, to the equation, which improved the strength of the steel further, but also critically improved the toughness, which made it less prone to brittle failure, which was the key failing of steel up to this point. The French firms Schneider and Creusot were early innovators in this field. Whilst the strength increase over compound armour was less than compound armour had been over iron, at only about 5%, it was still something. But as time wound on, and the 1890s began, a major innovation was coming that would refine nickel steel into a substantially better armour material. But this time, the innovation would not come from Britain, but from the United States of America, courtesy of Mr. Harvey. Whilst nickel steel had allowed homogeneous steel armour to be made practical, it had lost something of the ultra-hard former steel's resistance to impact. But the Harvey process now exploited the physics of steel to recreate the benefits of compound armour wholly within a single material. Now, it had been known for centuries that the balance of trace elements in steel could be combined with heating the metal to a variety of temperatures to create different forms of steel with different crystal lattices on a molecular level, even if the precise science behind this had obviously not been fully comprehended. But then, further varying how and at what rate the metal was cooled, you could affect the crystal growth within the metal as it was brought back down to normal solid temperatures. All this affected the material properties of the metal involved and can be illustrated by a phase change diagram, such as this one, which shows what temperatures created what forms of steel or iron at different levels of carbon or other trace material content. And there's pages and pages of these things if you study engineering. However, unlike forging a sword or a breastplate, massive blocks of steel need considerably longer to heat up and take a lot longer to cool down, with commensurately more effort needed if you're going to change this rate of heating or cooling for your benefit. The sheer mass of steel also meant that under the Harvey process, you could change the properties of some parts of armor plate without this spreading to the whole block if you didn't want it to. The changing crystal formations are what are shown on the phase change diagram, and it's the alignment and size of these which dictate much of the physical properties of the metal, depending of course on trace element content, which is why you end up with pages and pages and pages of slightly different phase change diagrams. The overall effect that Harvey was going for was called cementing or face hardening. Under the Harvey process, you'd start off with your sheet of nickel steel, i.e. you've gone through pretty much all of the process that you'd have gone through to make regular steel armor plate previously. Then you'd put your flat plate on a platform or other container and heap charcoal over the top of it. Then set fire to the whole thing and cook gently at about 1200 degrees Celsius for just over a fortnight. Bringing s'mores to work was apparently optional. What this eventually did is to cause carbon from the charcoal to seep into the steel, kind of a reverse process to the puddle furnaces that were designed to remove fuel-based impurities. Now you were using fuel to try and bring those impurities back in, or specifically the carbon part at least. As the steel never actually went molten, this higher carbon content was most present in the upper face of the plate, and decreased relatively rapidly the further in that you went. Then, with a pair of very large tongs, you picked up your steel plate and dipped it in a pool of oil to quench it, and then off into a water bath to finish the process off. Now, those of you who've watched shows like Forged in Fire will know that sticking a very hot piece of metal into water can create a lot of stress and brittleness in the metal, possibly even fractures. And so the plate would be heated back up again to several hundred degrees and allowed to cool much more slowly. This is a process called annealing, which gets rid of most of the stress points and generally softens the steel back down again, obviously assuming that you didn't crack it. As things progressed, this basic formula would be improved in a couple of ways. Firstly, by forging the steel after the water bath, which helped to de-stress it somewhat, and secondly, by replacing the water bath itself with water jets, as it was found that dropping superheated metal into water would cause an awful lot of steam to form at the interface between the water and the steel. This mimics the Leidenfrost effect, which is when you drop a little droplet of water onto an exceptionally hot frying pan, and it races around the frying pan on a little cushion of steam. And much as the droplet is insulated from the pan by a cushion of steam that it's generating, the steel was kept in a water bath from the cooling water by the layer of steam that it was generating. This, of course, affected the rate of cooling and made it more difficult to control, which factors into that whole phase change diagram we looked at earlier. Now, this process would give you a steel plate with an integral hardened face and a tougher back. This gave about a 20% greater level of resistance compared to nickel steel on its own. The Harvey process was rapidly adopted the world over, as you could once again drop the thickness of armour for the same protection and thus save weight. Compared to the old iron plate, Harvey steel offered at least 60% greater protection if you took the very best iron compared with the worst standard of manufacturing past Harvey steel. At its best, Harvey steel offered double the protection of the average wrought iron plate that had been in use as little as 10 to 15 years ago. It was also found that you could get similar results using the Harvey process if you used normal steel, at least in terms of overall shell resistance, but due to its tougher nature and thus more ductile back, nickel steel plates would take less widespread damage if penetrated once they'd undergone the Harvey process, and so were still the superior choice. The progress of armour resistance can be seen in that the last iron-protected British battleships, the Trafalgar class, had 20-inch thick belts. Whilst facing newer, bigger and more powerful guns, the follow-on Royal Sovereign class had a compound armour belt that nonetheless dropped to 18 inches but left the ship overall better protected. Then, as Harvey armour was introduced, belt protection dropped down to between 9 and 12 inches. But we're still 2 generations away from armour in its final form at sea. The next development would come from Germany, where the Krupp Steel Works started off with the Harvey process, but made a number of changes. Krupp steel was made with chromium added to the normal nickel-steel mixture, giving the new steel alloy a capacity for even greater hardness. Next, instead of the bed of charcoal, jets of carbon-rich superheated gas were blown into the face of the heated steel at great pressure, following which even more heat in the form of great burner jets was applied. This forced the cementing process, i.e. the introduction of more carbon to the steel, much deeper into the face of the steel. Before this level of heat could reach too far into the plate, i.e. about a third of the steel's overall depth was what you'd want, but this was much greater than obviously just the inch or two possible with the Harvey process, the face would then be rapidly cooled with pressurized jets of freezing cold water, following which the back, which had cooled more slowly in a bed of clay whilst the cemented front was being blasted by the ice water, would also get a jet of cooling liquids. This took advantage of the fact that the armour plate was so thick that these huge fluctuations in temperature on one side took a fair bit of time to translate through to the other. Now, if you kept up with the metallurgy so far, you'd recognise this process would give the steel an absurdly hard outer face that was relatively deep, as well as the tougher, more ductile back to hold it all together. And indeed, the basic Krupp steel proved to be about 15 to 20% more effective than Harvey steel armour. This would be further refined in the early 1900s with slight changes to the steel formula that now included not just iron, carbon, nickel and chromium, but also trace elements of manganese, silicon, phosphorus and sulfur. This allowed the back of the armour to retain more toughness, which reduced spalling and cracking and overall increased the effectiveness by about another 10%, thus giving the armour that would be used on most ships in the Dreadnought race approximately a 30% advantage in protection compared to Harvey armour. Thus, despite the continually increasing power of guns, armour belts remained relatively static in thickness during the late 1890s and early 1900s, the Royal Navy's armoured belts, for instance, hovering at around 9 inches thickness on their Krupp armoured pre-dreadnoughts until the Lord Nelson class, and then of course Dreadnought herself. German battleships likewise remained at between 9 and 10 inches of thickness, and American and French vessels at around 11 inches of maximum thickness, as said, in a period where gun performance was climbing quickly. Now at this point, it's probably worth a quick summation of the total process of armour manufacture as it now stood, remote and different as it was from the manufacture of what now seemed like relatively simple iron plate about 20 to 30 years previously. This is taken from a US Navy manual on the subject from the early 20th century. Step 1. The charge of pig iron and ore, or pig iron and scrap, still in use, make note, is melted in a basic open hearth furnace and is then poured into an iron or sand mould. The dimensions of an ingot are varied to suit conditions. For instance, an ingot for a 3-gun turret port plate is about 42 inches by 150 inches by 250 inches and weighs 425,000 pounds, whilst one for a belt plate is about 26 inches thick, 132 inches tall and 200 inches wide, and weighs about 200,000 pounds. Step 2. The ingot, whilst still hot, is stripped from the mould, cleaned and prepared for forging. Step 3. The ingot is then reheated and forged under a hydraulic press to within about 15% of the final thickness. The forging reduces the ingot to about 1/3 of its previous thickness. The segregation of impurities in the central upper portion is discarded by cutting this portion off. Step 4. The forging is annealed to produce a partially fibrous condition of the microstructure to prevent cracking and cooling and to eliminate the strains due to forging. Step 5. It is then supercarburized. The time required for this step varies with the size of the forging, with large forgings taking anything from 10 to 14 days. Step 6. Reheating, reforging to nearly the final thickness, and annealing now follow. Step 7. Several heat treatments may follow to develop the proper physical properties in the metal fibres. Step 8. The forging is next machined to rough dimensions. Step 9. It's then reheated and formed to shape. Step 10. The front face is then heated above the critical temperature, depending upon the depth of chill desired, and hardened by oil or water spraying. Step 11. After low heating, the curvature of the plate is rectified, and step 12, the plate is machined to the finished dimensions. That critical temperature, of course, being where the temperature climbs above the line on the phase change diagram that's necessary to get the desired form of the metal. So this then would be the armour that, with various combinations and minor variations, would see service in pretty much all the various navies of World War I. Now, post-war, there was one final further stage of developments. And this is where the various major armour manufacturers began to go off in their own unique directions as the process of armour manufacturing became more and more secretive, and we finally begin to see a divergence in armour capabilities that depends more on the country of origin and not so much on minor variations in manufacturing process and materials. One last diversion into material science before we go on. By this stage, there are many factors to consider when it comes to evaluating the true properties of armor steel and its various resistive properties. If enough people want, I can go into those and metal crystal structures, etc., but that will be for another video. Now, back to the World War II period and the immediate run-up to it. In Germany and the UK, further advances were made in the formula for the steel itself, introducing even more exotic trace elements such as molybdenum into the mix, and making subtle changes in the manufacturing process. These advances occurred independently of each other, but resulted in British and German face-hardened armour steel having superior resistive qualities to the World War I standard that almost everyone had used previously. Now, this is where sources disagree. I've said before in some dry docks, some give this new formula a 5 to 8% resistive advantage, others go as high as 25% better, whilst most tend to suggest something in the low teens. I personally usually settle at using around 12% in my estimates. Thus, if a ship's armour is of the old type, or the ship belongs to a nation that has not made any substantial improvements in their metallurgy since then, the armour of, say, a Scharnhorst or a Vanguard at 14 inches thick would be equivalent to almost 16 inches of the armour present on, say, a Queen Elizabeth, Pennsylvania, Kaiser, or Fuso class vessel, if we're using the 12% figure. In the USA, there was a rather disastrous project in the mid-1910s that would have an ongoing impact on all US battleship and cruiser armour thereafter. Ironically, this problem arose out of another part of the same US company having great success. This was Midvale. They'd come up with a new way of making stronger shells, their so-called unbreakable series of shells. And indeed, they proved quite effective. And so they decided to develop new armour to try and defeat and shatter them. Since one of the major advantages of Krupp-style armour over Harvey armour was the much deeper hardened face, Midvale decided that an even deeper face would obviously be better and went all in, deploying a block of steel that was 80% hardened face and 20% ductile backing. The armour succeeded in shattering the unbreakable shells, proving to be not quite as unbreakable as everyone thought, but further testing using 12, 14 and 16-inch variants of the unbreakable shell revealed that in actual fact the resistance of the plate, made up as it was of largely extremely hard brittle metal, had in fact dropped to about equivalent to Harvey steel. Only the sheer mass of the plate had given the shattering result. Now, this result is probably somewhat less surprising to you listeners, having just heard me go on at length about the various problems inherent with having too much brittle material in your armour. However, whilst this rather absurd 80-20 ductile-brittle ratio was walked back a bit, constantly improving armour-piercing shells and a constant desire to shatter them meant that US Class A armour, which was the US Navy's designation for face-hardened battleship and cruiser armour plate, would end up having a much deeper hardened face than anyone else in the 1930s and 1940s, at a 50 to 55% hardened depth. Now, this did result in absolutely phenomenal performance when it was used at cruiser-grade thicknesses against cruiser-grade guns, with the lighter-weight 6-inch and 8-inch projectiles smearing themselves all over it like flies over a windscreen. But past about 12-inch caliber shells, the scaling effect that had been noticed with the more extreme armour that we talked about from the Midvale 1910s era testing began to reassert itself, and this left Class A armour as of pretty decent material quality, but somewhat less actual resistive value compared to similar thicknesses of other nations' battleship plate going into World War II. As by now it was just as much the technique used to make the plate that made a difference as much as the material properties of the basic steel itself. Now, as an interesting side note, British armour, which we covered earlier, had the opposite issue. It had a thinner than average face, backed by absurdly high tensile strength ductile steel, which made the armour massively resistive against the largest battleship projectiles, but at the same time left British cruisers slightly more vulnerable than most. The Germans, meanwhile, varied their levels of trace elements in their armour depending on thickness, with the overall quality of their plate being pretty good at the higher thicknesses, hence the overall comparative values with the British plate, but dropping off to as bad as early 1900s Harvey or early Krupp steel levels in some cases when it came to cruiser grade plate, with a huge degree of variance. Now, the Japanese modified their production process by making the hardest part of their face somewhat inside the outer layer of the armour, with a much more gradual transition between hard and soft layers. This resulted in a good quality armour at cruiser grade thicknesses, but a relatively unremarkable level of resistance per inch at higher thicknesses, somewhat compensated for by the absurd thicknesses that were manufactured for parts of the Yamato class, although this did have a few problems arising as the thickest plates that they manufactured turned out to be so massive that the cooling systems used, the various jets of water and oil, couldn't actually cool the interior of the armour fast enough, which left these very large plates vulnerable to snapping on impact even if the shell didn't actually make it through. Now, the Italians had their own way of going about things, which happily straddled the line. They varied the thickness of their hardened face depending on how thick the armour they were making. This gave their tourney plate a similar effectiveness to US Class A armour against cruiser-grade firepower, as at this overall thickness it had a very deep face-hardened plate. But this would transition to a thinner and more British level of face hardening at battleship grades of thickness, thus exploiting those factors as well for good resistance at the upper end of thicknesses of plate, as well as the better cruiser performance. Now, this has led some sources to classify Italian plate as the best overall World War II armour plate, as it scores well at both ends of the scale, unlike practically everybody else's. But it's not the best battleship-specific plate due to its overall strength, and especially that of its backing section, being materially weaker than some other nations' armour. Quality control, however, was pretty good, which is somewhat ironic given the state of the Italian shell and charge manufacturing. Thus, by the World War II era and the final generation of shipboard armour, if you wanted to protect a cruiser, you'd be best off using either American or Italian, followed up by Japanese plate, in roughly that order, whereas if you wanted to protect a battleship, you would want British, German, or Italian plate, again roughly in that order. There's also homogeneous armour, that's armour plate without the face-hardened layers, but I think that can be for another time. So there you have it, a brief, potted history of the development of naval armour from simple iron plates all the way up to the World War II era. And I say brief, yes, it's taken us about 50 minutes, but on the other hand, if you really want to get into it, there are literally 2 to 3 inch thick books, and multiple of them, that discuss this subject. So, yes, there are a few small details here and there that I've left out, Yes, there are lots of variations. Yes, there's a huge body of testing that was involved in the manufacture and creation of these various plates, and yes, there were a lot of other interesting dead ends, such as the use of rubber as a backing material instead of wood, and so on and so forth. But hopefully, this has provided a relatively decent overview, and please feel free to engage in many technical and engineering discussions in the comments below, or perhaps the more mundane conversations, as I will enjoy both. But I might be a little bit more tempted to engage on the really complex engineering side of things, because after all, as I said, that is what I was trained for way back when. Anyway, thank you very much for listening.
That's it for this video. Thanks.